As we go through the session, there will be a chance to ask questions at the end. But one thing I wanted to kind of point out about these sessions is there's loads of places to get help with data preparation. And one of the ones that we created with the help of Tableau recently was actually a space on the Tableau community forums. We've titled it Prepping Data because that's where we're getting most of the kind of attention in terms of people practicing with data prep, but actually it's kind of just a little bit of a hub to ask lots of different Tableau prep questions in general. So we're popping up the solutions to the challenges on here, some useful links to go through. And we're hoping this kind of becomes just a little bit more of a general space where people feel free to dive in, ask questions, post some answers. And really the people who are going to be helping us look after this and work our way through this is kind of part of the Prep and Data team that are kind of built. So from Jonathan and myself, Allchin, originally the kind of two founders of Prep and Data, we've then gone and grown that out a little bit and added Jenny Martin and Tom Prowse to the team. And Tom spends a good chunk of time just making sure that he's available for questions on the community forum. So if you've got those questions, feel free to ask them. Tom will be around to go and help answer those as he goes through. As I've mentioned before in the previous couple of days, we do have the how-to prep index. And the 4 sessions that we're going through this week are the first 4 chapters, or the first 4 posts in that way. So the how to shape data, there's a bit more detail than what I'll just go through in this webinar in that post. And then tomorrow's how not to need data prep at all, and where you can actually still use desktop or some of the other solutions that are out there. Spoiler alert, we do need prep. So in tomorrow's session, we'll kind of get into why that's still needed. There are lots of other chapters within the how to prep index on prepanddata.blogspot.com, all the way through from connecting those files into how to deal with different data types, the functions and calculations you might want to use to deal with those, cleaning up data, connecting to multiple data sets. But the piece I do want to point out is there's a lot of content to go through when we talk about shaping your data. So I've built some kind of much longer posts around pivoting data, aggregating, forming calculations. They're kind of the major 3 buckets where you'll start to see the shape of your data fundamentally changing and you taking active decisions to go and reshape that data, ultimately to make it better and easier for your analysis. So if you find the content that we cover off nice and easy today, that's a place to go and just go and stretch those skills a little bit further. With those posts, you'll also find some of the Prep and Data challenges that will link at the end of that to then go and practice those skills. So feel free to check those out and work your way through those too. Makes life a lot easier going forwards if you've got a few kind of miles under your belt to know that if that kind of challenge pops up in your everyday life, then you've dealt with it a couple of times, you know what to recommend. As I mentioned in previous days, we do actually have all of those posts forming together into this book, published by O'Reilly, Tableau Prep up and running. You can get a 10-day trial. I've actually got some links to hand out that gives you longer trials, and that's to O'Reilly's full online learning platform, which has got the first 5 chapters of the book put together, hopefully releasing more over the next couple of weeks. So I'll tweet those out a little bit later on today, and I'll try and drop those into the meetup session as well. So you've got that link. But let's go and get stuck into the actual meat of today's session. You'll have noticed in the last couple of days that we kind of just go through a presentation to walk you through some of the theoretical concepts, and then we'll go and look at that hands-on in Tableau Prep. That's exactly what I intend to do again today. Just to kind of give you the idea of what we're trying to do and then show how we actually go and apply that within Tableau Prep. So yeah, today is all about shaping our data and making that as easy as possible going forwards. So let's dive in, let's have a look. As I say, one more session to come tomorrow, and all of the recordings are out there. I've been posting them at the end of the Let's Talk Data sessions on Meetup, so those sessions should absolutely be out there. The recordings are there to, if you have missed one, to go and pick those up. But for those of you who've joined me each day, thank you very much. Love the questions that we got at the end of yesterday's session, and also Monday's session was good fun too. So yeah, have those questions ready for the end. So prep and data, like I say, useful for those challenges and those how-to posts, etc. New challenge is actually out today, so that's one that's going to be particularly tricky. I have to say, it's been thought up by Gwilym Lockwood in the information lab team. It's based on some of the work that is done with clients looking at market basket analysis. So not necessarily a good one to dive into if it's your first challenge, unless you've got a bit of experience with data prep. But that will be challenge. I think it's 61, which is quite scary that we're up that high already, but there we go. So Tableau Prep, just as a recap, if you are new to us today, then what we mean by Tableau Prep is actually two tools. Tableau Prep Builder, where we're actually going to go and connect the data, work through a series of logical steps and manipulations, cleaning steps of that data, all the way through to where we go and either save that data source somewhere as either a CSV file, Hyper, or Tableau data extract, or we go all the way through and then actually publish that up to the server. Oh, sorry, skipping ahead a little bit too far. And we publish that up to the server. Now, if you want that workflow to refresh, if you've got new data that's coming into that, then that's where Prep Conductor, this kind of scheduling tool, but also a way to go and share posts between others. That's a tool that fundamentally sits within your Tableau server. So that's the kind of difference between those two tools. I've mentioned this a few times because it really does mean that things do change, but Tableau Prep was only officially launched back in April 2018. Since then, it's on a monthly release schedule, so there's a lot of different additions and updates that are continually made to the tool. So yeah, it's a good one just to kind of keep your eye on compared to Tableau's quarterly releases, or Tableau Desktop's quarterly releases, sorry. But what is Prep fundamentally aimed at? Well, it's aimed at solving simple, repeatable data prep tasks. Now, I use that term simple loosely. They can absolutely be those simple things that you just always got to open up Excel or your data set, do that manipulation, save it, and then you can actually do your analysis. You can do some absolutely really complex things with it, and hopefully you'll see some of that through Gwilym's market basket analysis. So that'll be week 15. 2020 for prep and data, but also some of the examples you'll see kicking around and what people share are really key. Josh Milliken, for example, in the first Tableau Prep user group that we did, that's organized by Jack Parry from the Data School. Josh showed how to actually go and really break down complex web scraping almost within prep, and how to go and derive out data that's kind of quite hidden away within pretty messy constructs. So as much as I say that prep's aimed at the simple side, it can be used for some really advanced use cases as well. But really it's taking Tableau's user focus and applying all of those things that we need to do before we can go and start visually analyzing our data sets. But taking some of those visual cues and clues that we love to get from data visualization to help us analyze data, and putting that into the data preparation layer, and does that neatly. Again, you'll see a little bit more of that as we go through. But let's talk about shaping data. So when we talk about shaping data, the session we did yesterday talked about planning for your preparation. And actually, whenever you do anything within prep, it is no different. So that's really why I'm starting with, again, almost a little repeat of yesterday, of saying you've got to go and know your data. You've got to know what that input comes in as, to then go and start to understand where you want to go with it. But knowing that input is key. So here you can see I've just got this simple data set around some ice cream. It's a sunny day in the UK. That's pretty rare. So I thought I'd celebrate that by thinking about ice cream. And we've got a couple of measures here, so sales and profit for each of our categories, our types of ice cream. Or maybe I've done this as soap actually, who knows, doesn't matter. Let's talk about ice cream, why not, way more fun. And then we've got an individual column for each of our months with the different values that we have within that. Now, if you've used Tableau Desktop for a while or before, you'll know that actually this isn't an ideal data set to go and feed into Tableau. We'd want to make some changes to this. And trying to work out what those changes are comes down to that planning process. Yesterday, I shared kind of how I go and sketch and actually doodle out the ideas of what sits behind the data. But there's nothing wrong with saying that you could actually do that electronically. So here within Excel, I've started to actually go and think about what needs to go where. And so some of the encoding that I've used before to do this, and I go into this in a bit more detail in the blog post, is actually still start to think about Tableau's traditional discrete fields, the blues, the continuous fields, the greens, and then just also go and think about what becomes a header within my data set. So what sits as those column titles that we want to be there. And also then what are the actual values either within those discrete fields. So in this case, it would be our types of ice cream or soap, depending on what those flavors actually are or scents. But ultimately that would sit in our category column. So actually that's looking pretty good. That's not too bad. But then, well, we'd have a measure and we'd want to break up our sales and profit. So that maybe wouldn't become necessarily a kind of column header in its own right, but the things that would be sales and profit. So I'm kind of using a darker encoding to go and show that actually they're the things I want to think about as my column headers. And then what would I put inside that? Well, actually, I've got date. I haven't really got a date column anywhere within my data set at the moment. So that's telling me that I'm going to need to go and reshape my data potentially quite a lot to go and form that. But the values that would kind of then go and sit alongside those dates, under that date column would be my individual date values. I probably need to clean those up if I'm loading those into Tableau. But then I'd also have my values for my headers of my sales and profit to be the values that I'm finding in my table at the moment. So just even first taking that kind of step back, looking at what categorical data that you have, looking at what the value data you have, makes that kind of just a good first step. So really think about that input data as key, but actually thinking about the output data is essential. Like you even heard in the language I started to use then, the thoughts I started to have became a lot more about, well, actually, what's the output going to be? What do I need it to be within Tableau? And it's that data structure. You need to think about how you're going to go and analyze that data. We don't really want sales and profit numbers in the same column because that's going to make it really difficult to go and analyze those numbers. Tableau is a columnar data tool. So it's looking at columns of our data to go and use those individually. So not only do you need to go and sketch out that input, as we mentioned yesterday, go and sketch out that output. And again, here I've just gone and manipulated things around within within Excel to go and think about how I would load that into Prep. So we've got our categories, we've got the different dates, even just starting to think out just for a few rows, how many records am I likely to see for each of the combinations that I'm going to have of my categories? Because you'll see as we go through the actual process today of reshaping data, we often change the number of rows in our data set a lot. I use the term rows and records a little bit flexibly, but a row of data is purely just a row of data. Whereas what I talk about as a record is, do I have something that's unique within my category? So a unique combination of, in this case, of category and date. Here I do, I don't have any duplication within there. I would class that as a record. So in January 2019, mint choc chip, we had sales of 6,933 and a profit of 965. Great, that's a record. It's also a row within my data set. We'll look at the aggregation step later, but where you've got multiple rows to an individual record, you want to think about the aggregation behind there potentially. So going through that process, thinking that through, that becomes super useful to be able to go and work that through. I start to do that when planning this output data, because what that's going to help me do is just make sure I stay on the straight and narrow as I kind of work my way through my flow, and I don't start going off on a tangent or accidentally start duplicating data through maybe using the wrong technique for what I'm trying to do. That's really where you're going to go and stumble the most, which is why we're talking about this today, of how do you then go and manage that? How do you go and work your way through from that? So when you're thinking about the output, you want to think about where you're going to go and use that data. Tableau Prep is designed to produce data sets for Tableau Desktop or Tableau Server even. That's absolutely fine. You might want to use that data elsewhere. You might want to load it back into a database. As I mentioned on Monday's session around why do we want to do and use self-service data prep, Tableau at the conference last year announced that they're going to release in kind of over the next year or so, the ability to go and write to a database. So actually, maybe that database is then analyzed by Tableau, but you might be writing files back to a database table to actually go and be clear and sort that data out to make that analysis easier in the future. Depending on where you're going to go and output that data to, depends on what shape you want to go and create it for. Ultimately, if that table is going to be used from that database in Tableau, you're going to have a similar answer as to what we're about to talk through now. So what does Tableau want? Well, ideally we want a single row per record. So it's that combination of categories I like to think about on a pretty simplistic level. There will be examples where you don't have this, but in most cases, a single row per record. Also, you want each of your columns in your data to be an identifiable data field. And I'll come back to that logic in just a sec. And we want each column to be a single data type. Now, quite often what you'll find within data sets is maybe, especially within Excel or off the back of a SQL table, is you'll have sometimes a column of data that's actually had concatenation happen. So that's where we've gone and pulled different data items together into kind of maybe an ID field or something like that. You'll actually want to break those apart. If we're trying to clean this data up for analysis, maybe I want my ID separately from the category that's being joined to form a single column. Also, maybe one of those things is a number. One of those things would be string or text. So if I want to be able to go and add up those numbers or aggregate those numbers in a certain way, we need to break those apart to get that single data type. And also thinking about that kind of ideal of having that clear identifiable data field for each column. That's really where I start thinking about dates. So here I've got an example within Tableau Desktop where I've just gone and formed all of my months into a single column. That makes life so much easier than having to kind of bring out multiple months. So each month, if that's an individual column, I would have multiples out here. And what that would stop me doing is actually having this nice singular access. Because for those of you who haven't used desktop that much or kind of it's not quite twigged about this, these green fields, the continuous data fields within your data set, whenever placed on columns or rows, they form an axis. So really you don't want to have to battle multiple axes quite a lot. Here we want all of our months just on a single continuous axis. So that's why we need to have a single date field within our data set. And that's really where pivot comes into play quite a lot within our data preparation, as we'll see in a bit. But we also want to think about those categories. In this case, I'm talking about categories and using a field called category. Should have thought this through a little bit more. But what you have here on this view is we've formed a sum of sales. We've drawn an axis across where our rows would be within a table if we think about pivot tables within Excel. That's where we're getting our total sales values. But then we go and break those down by our individual categories here. So the members of this category column, so furniture, office supplies, and technology. Classic superstore example from Tableau. So the data set that gets shipped with pretty much every version of Tableau Desktop that I know of anyway. We take that overall total sales value, normally about 2.2 million or 2.294 million if I want to be precise. I work with Superstore way too much. And then we're seeing how that gets divided up as that total sales number across those three categories. If you had furniture, office supplies, and technology in different columns, you're not going to be able to go and create this nice clean break across those sales numbers. So again, thinking about how you're going to go and visualize that data. And we spoke about sketching for our data preparation yesterday, because often when I teach, we start with Tableau Desktop. So starting with Tableau Desktop means we think about how we're consuming that data. What I also do is I get people to sketch what they want to actually go and visualize. How might they look at it? Not necessarily that's the way it's definitely going to come out, because until you start analyzing the data, you don't know whether that's maybe the right chart or the best way to show it. But it gives you a starting place for thinking about how you might want to have your data structured. If you go and draw a bar chart and you know that you've got three categories, it's going to give you a good clue that you need to have category on columns and sum of sales, if that's your measure, on rows, or if you wanted to create a horizontal bar, it would be category on rows and sum of sales on columns. By doing that, you're thinking about what data items you need to use, because actually sometimes the answer is data sets can become big and unwieldy. If those columns aren't going to ever be needed for your analysis, it's okay to get rid of them and start thinking about where do we want to actually go and filter out data. There's a couple of different chapters on the how-to posts talking about filtering and smarter filtering, because it's kind of a big subject in its own right, and trying to work out this perfect way to go and build a data set that everybody can use, but it doesn't become too big and unwieldy. That's another fine line to tread. So trying to think that through is a kind of big balance to go and work your way through. So what are some of those techniques that we're going to have to be able to allow us to go and reshape that data? And ultimately, what I want to go through in this section is looking at not just the technique, but also what actually happens to our data within that. So I'm going to use the term slimmer, taller, wider, and shorter. So that's why I thought I'd start with pivots. Because within Tableau Prep, we've actually got two options: taking columns to more rows, or taking rows to columns. So two different kind of ideas. So what do they actually mean? As you can see from my first bullet point, when we talk about columns into rows, we're turning data sets from what they are currently into slimmer and taller versions. So let's go and have a look at this first image down this bottom left-hand corner. Table A, my original table, if I've got my individual months working their way across as individual columns, as we've just seen for Tableau, that's not ideal. It'd be much easier to go and have all of those dates in one column and all of the relevant values sitting alongside those. So going from this table that's 4 columns wide, 3 rows of actual data, what we're going to do would use a columns to rows pivot that makes the table taller and slimmer, because we turn from those 4 columns into just 3 columns. So we're getting rid of those month columns and creating that separate date column, which goes and stretches out that table quite a lot, and then goes and drops in the values alongside. Hopefully you can see by the basic numbering that I've used here that in January, for type A, we've got the number 1, B, type value 2, C, value 3. You're seeing how that's going and forming into that table as table B, the output from that columns to rows. So that's what we talk about, making a table slimmer, theoretically just less columns, but also taller. Normally a columns to rows pivot will go and increase the length of that table. Lots of people worry about that for performance. Actually, that's how Tableau prefers data. It is super fast at working its way through columns, creating those aggregations. That makes life a lot easier for it. And I think I mentioned other answer to a question the other day, the longest data set I've ever worked with is 3.5 billion rows in Tableau. And I was doing some quite complex calculations and they were coming back in about 20 or 30 seconds. So 1, way faster than me using a calculator, and 2, absolute no issue. That comes down to the power of the data source normally, as to how well that can actually process that. But what about rows to columns? There are situations where, as you can see here, where we've got multiple measures going down across our table, or going down through our table, then actually I want to go and have an individual column for each of those measures, because I want to be able to go and flexibly analyze my sales or analyze my profits, analyze my discounts. How would that actually work out when we go and pivot our data from rows to columns? Well, that's going to go in the opposite direction what we saw from our columns into rows. We're going to go and make our table shorter, because we're taking those rows and turn them into individual columns. And we're making our data therefore wider, because we'll get a new column for each of the measures that we're dropping in. We'll go into a worked example of this as we go through our kind of example in prep that a little bit later. Unions. Unions is another classic way, and we've seen in a couple of examples I've used so far, where unions are just appending data sets, so adding additional data onto others, almost like stacking up data. I used the example, I think, of Jenga previously, that you're just going to go and stack those different elements, in the case of Jenga, those individual bars on top of each other. Sometimes they don't match perfectly, that's fine. You can have holes in your data that are likely to appear as nulls, but you'll see how the data kind of builds and gets taller and taller as you union data sets on top of each other. The question I often get asked about these is, well, what happens if I have mismatched fields? Well, first of all, let's talk about what creates a mismatched field within a union. It's where we have different names in our data sets. So here I've got some soap sales from my lead store and my York store, but in my lead store, they capture the flavor, the type of soap, the scent as the word scent, and all in that column. Where in my York store, they're capturing that scent as actual type. We mean the same thing, they've just called them 2 different things. So if you're just doing a basic union, what will happen is your data will get a little bit wider because you've got those mismatched fields. Tableau will try and always have those columns available to you to work with. It's just where we don't have that other value. So in the case of York, we don't have any data fields called scent. We'll just go and get some nulls sitting alongside there. Whereas the same for leads, but for type, we'd have some nulls there. what we'd do in reality is select both of those columns in Prep and do what we call a merge. So that's what we mean by merging those mismatched fields if we base it on name. Now, if you don't want to go through those steps, an easier thing to do is take one step before your union and just go and make sure those data columns are named the same thing if they are the same thing. Sometimes it's easy to see the data, see the output of that union to understand whether they are the same thing or not. Joins, everybody's favorite, and I use that term slightly tongue-in-cheek. Joins can be really complex. They can also be easy. We saw yesterday just doing a basic inner join. I think we're joining based on category. And we had a nice load of matches, relatively straightforward, nice and easy. There's a reason why I've done a really long post and actually then I've done a separate post on advanced joins. They can get complex. Some really neat little techniques that Prep opens up to do a little bit more complexity than the average. But also we saw yesterday that we have that kind of beautiful configuration pane where we're seeing not only the inputs, what's coming into that join, but we're also seeing what's outputted, also what's not outputted, what's being excluded. We have the ability to go and work with that and see that data within Prep. So it does make life easier if you're not used to joins. Ultimately, what we're doing with joins is rather than stacking data sets on top of each other, we're going to go and add columns from one data set onto another to create a slightly different output. It's fundamentally making the data wider. Unions will make that data set taller. Joins will then make that data set wider because we're adding columns. Really, with unions, you're adding rows onto your data set. Joins we're making wider. I will caveat that again a little bit, where sometimes joins can make your data sets a lot taller. And that's where you can sometimes create duplicates or bring back multiple records for each of your original records based on what you're actually joining onto that. Let's say if you're a customer of a bank and you have just a basic account. If I have that as a data set, obviously I've got lots of different customers. Let's say I've got, let's keep it simple, 10. But if I go and look at what the average balance was every month of the year for each of those customers, all of a sudden I'm going to have 120 rows of data in my data set because the 12 months times by my 10 customers, I'm going to have 120 rows of data. That's not a bad thing. That's actually what we expect. It goes back to that idea of planning for the output of what do you actually want and what level of granularity you want from that. Maybe the answer is you just want one average balance across the whole year for your clients. Well, in that case, you're just going to have to go and use an aggregation step to go and average that out across that year. But overall, you want to think about the number of rows that come off the back of the join, but really you're using your join tools to go and add those columns. That's why I say we mostly think about joins as making our data sets wider. In this case, if we were looking to join these two tables together, to not look at just how frequent someone's getting one of our subscription packages, but how much they're actually paying for it, then what we'd actually look for is the common links between these two tables. And in this case, it's just this packages ID. So with our packages, we've got what subscription package it would link into. So in this case, we'd only be able to get details back for our product name and our price for Jamie, because we'd only be able to go and say where 1 is equal to 1. We need to go and get the rest of the data in our subscription packages to go and work out how much and what Jonathan, Charlie, and Ellie are actually buying from our subscription packages and how frequently they're getting them. So how much revenue we're going to get off the back of that. But that's where we'd look to go and join those two tables together to create one data set. Ultimately, that's the thing to remember with joins and with unions, that all data tools want one data set to work with off the back of that to go and tie all of those things together. So we've got to go and bring in all of those different sources, get it into one potentially bigger table, and then we're going to go and work with that. Aggregate. This is an interesting step within Prep, and it's one that Tableau desktop users possibly find a little bit more challenging. We are so used in Tableau desktop to be able to go and drag in a dimension and change the level of aggregation that we're working with. Not how we're aggregating, but just what we're actually aggregating by. Earlier, you saw the example of me just having a sales access showing the 2.2 million, And then as soon as I bring in category, each of those categories are around 800,000 in terms of our sales. The aggregate step's doing exactly that within prep. In this example, I've got my types of furniture. If I grouped by my types of furniture, we get rid of the detail that is item, and we'd go and see the total cost for each of those types of items. You can see by the color coding what's gone into each of my individual totals. For prep, off the back of this, if I just put type of item into our group by and summed up our total costs, so took that total cost column and put that into what we're actually going to go and aggregate, we would actually just come up with three numbers, three rows of data, one for furniture, one for accessory, and one for decoration. So it does get rid of all of the other data fields that aren't used within that aggregate step. That's where it becomes a little bit trickier. So you want to go and plan out that step and use that at the right time. So you're only relieving yourself with the data that you actually want to use. Obviously, you can get rid of data with filtering. As I say, go and have a look at those posts. But ultimately, the aggregate step's just behaving a little bit differently. The type of shape change that that's making to our data set is it's making the data set shorter. In this case, it's changing those, how many we've got, 6 rows. It would be down into just 3. It wouldn't be held in this way. I was just trying to fit everything into my screenshot. So we're going to go and make the data set shorter because you're aggregating it up, probably raising that data to a higher level of detail than what it is. That means there's less detail in the actual view. Talking about directions of granularity is always a fun one when you're training. But if we talk about having less detail in our data set as a result of our aggregate step, that's the right way to think about it. So less detail means less rows. So that's where we're actually forming that from. So how does that all fit into action? Well, let's go and work our way through the data set. So what I've done is I've taken the example we walked through yesterday. So it's the week 6 from 2019 prepping data, where we've got some sales that we've captured from our England stores. You'll see that we've added some extra detail to that. We've got our soap pricing data, we've added some extra detail to that. And we still want to go and append that all onto our company data for what we have at the moment. Potentially adding some extra information to go and nudge Scotland that we need some extra data from them going forwards. So yes, I've called it week 6 input plus, because we're going to go and get some more detail. So at that point, I'm going to dive into Tableau Prep Builder. And within Tableau Prep Builder, as you've seen me do before, I'm going to go and connect to that data set. That's going to be within Excel. And then within Excel, I'm just going to go and pick up my week 6 input. I've called it week 6 input plus because I've added an extra little bit of detail here. Now, spoiler alert, I'm going to turn this into our week what are we up to? Week 16, 2020 Tableau Prep and Data Challenge. Basically just to let you all have the data set to go and play and go and test out your skills off the back of this webinar. So first things first, let's go and bring out our England data. And as you'll see, it looks similar to what we actually had yesterday. As always, I find it much easier to add a clean step off the back of our input to go and look at what that data set looks like. Now, for those of you who were with us yesterday, we saw that we had our units sold, but actually now what we've also got is we've got some target data as well. Also, we've got a different category. We've got shower gel that's been added into the mix. I can either see that from my profile pane or from my data in the detail at the bottom. So no matter which one you work with, the profile pane or the detail pane, you would see this different shape of data than what we've had before. In this case, the measures, and also the fact that we've got 3 categories now, rather than just our original 2. Let's go and look at what else we've got in our other data sets, just to go and spot those changes for what's there at the moment. I'm just going to change that color into yellow, and I'll show you why I'm doing that in a sec. So with our soap pricing data, again, we could go and actually look at that as the input, or ultimately, not an aggregate step, misclick, let me just remove that. Let's go and add a clean step to go and look at that data. Here you'll see we've got a third type of soap again. This time it's antibacterial. In the England data, we added in shower gel. So actually we've got some challenges of what we want to do with the data there. That's where you'd start planning around, what do I care about? What do I want to do with this data? What do I want to report? And what do I not want to report? I'll come back to that logic in a bit when we start to tie these 2 data sets together. Apart from that, that data set seems pretty similar to what we had before. And the company data, I'm just going to make that a dark green. And I'm just going to go again and look at that within our clean step. You'll see that we're still missing the March detail. If I look at March, we've got no detail coming in from England. Only the rows that exist are highlighted. So that's where we can see that we've got data coming in from Scotland, but not anywhere else. So that's what we ultimately need to go and mesh that all together. So I need to, first of all, ultimately go and form my profit numbers, where in my England data, I only have the actual units sold and the targets. Targets is going to be a field that we carry through to the end of our data set, and that's what we're going to go and nudge Scotland to go and do. So what we're going to do, first of all, is go and start to kind of manipulate this data around a little bit. I mentioned very early on in week 1 that sometimes you'll see this light bulb come up. These are just suggestions as to what we want to do. Actually, the first thing we want to do is manipulate this data and reshape it quite a lot. So I'm just going to ignore my light bulb. For the moment, it's recommendations and just work on something a little bit different. So the first thing we're going to do today is actually pivot. Because I've got those 2 individual measures, it'd be much easier to analyze if I have those data columns as 2 individual columns, one for target, one for unit sold. Because otherwise I'm just got a complete mix of values actually within there. It's difficult to see what we actually have where. Let me go and add a pivot step. And then we think about what kind of pivot we want to do. That's currently a little bit hidden in my opinion. It's kind of away at the top here. But what you're going to go and select is which type of transition do we want to do? Do you want to go and take columns, different columns, and turn them into more rows, so making the data set taller and slimmer? Or are we going to make the data set wider? Well, I want to go and take that one measure column and go and turn that into the 2 separate measures. So I'm going to make the data wider. That's where I know I want to go and take those individual rows and turn them into columns. That changes our pivot setup for how we want to go and do that. So I'm going to go and grab my measure and drop that into my field that's going to become my new columns. That was the text that was there before. Sorry, I jumped through that a bit quickly. So dropping into this top section will be the field that will pivot to turn into my columns. Currently, we can only have one thing within there. So that's just going to be my measure. You'll see where we then get the list of, okay, so I'm going to get a column for target and a column for our units sold. And then we've got to go and put the values into there for what's actually going to be within those columns. We can go and set up the aggregation. I've worked with this data set before, so I know that we haven't got any duplication, so it's okay leaving it some. Otherwise, there's a little bit of a safety. We'd want to do average or minimum or maximum, potentially depending on what we're actually doing. You could actually count that value just to make sure you have got a one unique record if you want to, just to go and sense check that before you carry on. You can build safeguards and checking and validation into your data work. And that's something that you kind of will work your way through and build in as you become better at doing this kind of stuff. Let's go and have a look at what that turns into. So that's gone and created me my target and my unit sold. As I mentioned yesterday, those new columns, those manipulated columns in Prep go to the left. So it just makes it easier to see what's actually changed. The ordering of those columns really doesn't make too much of a difference for us at all. So we have our category. That's what we're going to go and link our soap pricing details to go and take those units sold and work out the actual value so we can test our profit against our targets that we should actually be achieving. To do that, we'll just do the same calculation that we did yesterday. Just go and creating a custom calculation where we're taking that type of soap and just adding the word soap on the end of that. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to do that if we had our shower gel. And as our sneaky tip from yesterday, if you name your new calculated field the same as an existing calculated field, also the same as an existing data field, it just overwrites that. Clicking on save does that. We now have our 3 different soaps. Like I say, you could use an if statement if you wanted to get gel in there, if it was shower, for example. However, you need to go and manipulate that data. To join those data sets together, we go and drag one up onto the other and say whether we want to union or whether we want to join. We want to join because we're going to go and add those manufacturing costs and selling price columns to the end of our existing data set. And we need to say how we're going to go and join those. So we add a join clause or a join condition, as they're also known, saying that where the category is the same as the type of soap, let's go and pull those together. And I'm currently using an inner join. So only where that conditions match for each of our rows is that going to bring me back my data set? So I've got 6 rows of data coming in from my input of my England data, 2 from my my soap pricing details, but all of a sudden you can start seeing that I've got some excluded. Those 6 until what we saw yesterday were still included. The additional rows within my data set are currently being excluded. So I want to think about what I'm going to do with these. Well, in this case, shower gel and antibacterial soap, that doesn't really help me if I've only got the units sold and I've got no way of forming the profit. So our shower gel, we would have our units sold number, but we wouldn't have our ways of forming that profit number. That's not going to be of any use to me. I'm going to cut that data out. So I wouldn't have that left outer side of the join selected. And the same for the antibacterial soap, just because I know how much it costs to actually, what's our selling price and how much we're actually, it costs to actually make the antibacterial soap. Well, we haven't sold any, so it doesn't matter. So again, I wouldn't bring back where we've only got those left values that aren't actually, that are currently being excluded by just the inner join. So where we don't have that category equal that type. So this is where we actually use a join. Yes, we're adding columns, but we're also taking some of the data out. So again, those number of rows are changing. That's part of the fun with joins and thinking through what's actually going on within there. So let's add a clean step. Let's look at what's happened. Well, we've got our targets coming through. We've got our units sold. We've got type of soap and category. Because we're using an join, we know they are the same. So I can just go and remove one of those. And as per yesterday, we just need to go and create that profit calculation where I'm then going to work out my selling price minus my manufacturing cost, wrap those all in brackets. And I'm just going to go and multiply that by the actual number of units sold. And that will give me my profit nicely. That allows me just to go and get rid of a couple of our columns that we no longer need for our analysis, knowing where we're going to go with our output. And so that's just kind of helping us work through this data set to know where we're up to. Also within this, I'm just going to go and create my date. And let's just do my date field. See if we can get it to union. When I went through this example last night, it did actually union. But I'm guessing the joy of working with technology, it's not going to play ball again today, as it did yesterday when we unioned our data set. But hey ho, let's see where we get up to. Now, the one thing to think about with this as our data set is actually I've got my profit across all of my individual cities. I don't need that at the moment. So I'm actually going to go and use my aggregate step to go and change the granularity of this data. So we're going to make the data set shorter. So I'm going to go and group by my category. We want that to be in our output. And I also want country to be in my output as well. I do want date. I know I only have one date within here, but again, if I don't put any of our fields in group fields or our aggregate fields, it doesn't come out the back of this data set. I'm going to go and sum my profits. And I've got to think about how I want to do my targets. Are my targets unique per store? In this case, they are. So I'm actually going to go and sum those up because I'm going to go and look at the target then for the whole of England. I've allocated individual targets per store. If it was actually my targeting was done at the level of England, then I'd want to use average within that. But I know how those targets are formed, so I can go and work that through. And then my data set looks a lot smaller, a lot cleaner off the back of that. Let's just actually go and look at the data itself. We've just got our 2 columns. Our 2 rows for March, for England, for our 2 different types of soap where we have our profit numbers as well as knowing our targets for those as well. And that allows us to then go and union these data sets together. Let's go and union those. So when my OCD kicks in and I want to make this easy to document, so I want that to become my light green. And off the back of that, we'll just have, we'll leave that as that color, just to go and show those 2 have been merged together. So in my union step, we can now see that we've got our table names. And again, you can start using those as data items if you want to. Yesterday, we actually got rid of those. We've got our dates. Our date and month hasn't unioned, but that's this time because I called it something different. So I'll show you how to do the merge just quickly. Select both of those columns, holding down Shift or Control, and then we can actually just say merge those columns together. And what's happened is Tableau just basically goes and takes the most populated column and merges that together. So we get rid of all of those nulls because we either had a date or we had a month. Our target is largely null, apart from England in our March, because we don't actually have those targets elsewhere within our data set. So we'll actually go and nudge Scotland to go and start capturing those targets. And also England, we need to go back and set up some targets for our earlier months within our data set. But we do have our profit all the way through. Let's go and have a look at that data set. Looking good. The profile looks as we expect, having quite a few nulls that we want to go and sort out over time. I put the wrong year in. Oh, I knew I'd do something a little bit daft. So let me just go back and change that calculation where I'm adding date. A year ahead of myself from when I first wrote this challenge. So let me save that. Then I can go back into my data pane. Oh, it's now created a null off the back of it. Doesn't like 2019, did like 2020. So let me just go and check that merge. And for some reason that's completely ducked itself away. So I should have my dates within there. Let me just go and group those as we did yesterday. Still haven't worked out why that's happening. It's a little bit bizarre to say the least. There we go. We've got our right month against there. And then we've got a nice clean output. We're ready to go. Again, the profile pane saves me, makes me spot errors within my data set that I can just quickly go back and iterate and change and work my way through. So that is where I'd go and create my output. Maybe I'd go and publish this one to the server as a data source, or I'm just going to go and save that as a file, and I would run that when I'm ready to go. But that's how you can start just going and shaping and manipulating your data quite a lot to work it through to its end goal. Some of these steps are necessary because of what you're trying to do, whether you're having to form certain calculations. Others are just trying to get the data to the right level of granularity. That's where we're using Aggregate. So when we talk about shaping data, yes, some of it is to go and shape the data for the right output. Other bits of that shaping is what's going to happen to your data set as you go through and work with it. Knowing and understanding what's likely to happen when you go and take those individual steps, whether it's a union, whether it's a join, whether it's a pivot, which type of pivot, and whether it's an aggregation, means that you can just work a little bit more confidently. So hopefully that walkthrough has helped you just kind of gone and piece those bits of knowledge together. So to go with planning out your data set, both the input and the output, you're going to be able to kind of work through with a little bit of knowledge of what's likely to happen as you go and take those steps, what needs to happen in what order, and also off the back of that, as you go and work through, you'll get a bit more confident as to what's happening and why. So at that point, I'm going to stop and say, if you've got any questions, then feel free to throw them into the chat, and we can have a little bit more of like generic questions, or if you've just got any questions about prep, pop them in there, and then I will go and work my way through those as they come in. But apart from that, if you don't have any questions, then thanks for joining us today. I'll stay on the line just for a minute or so to answer some of those questions. And yeah, please feel free to come back tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. UK time, and we'll talk through about where do you not need to use Tableau Prep. You know, where can you still go to complete some of these tasks elsewhere that might be a little bit easier, or why you might want to avoid prep in certain circumstances. But again, as I said earlier, spoiler alert, we're going to want to use prep quite a lot. So I'll show you why and how we can overcome some of those. So yeah, looking forward to hearing from you all again tomorrow, and seeing you all again tomorrow, and we can work our way through from there.